Welcome to the Wounded Angels Network as we continue to explore the theme of the radical Christ. This is the third session and we're busy building a foundation. Firstly, in the first session we looked at the difference between knowing and believing, and that famous comment of Carl Jung in that interview. I don't believe, I know. So the difference between dogma and experience. The mystical rather than the mediated experience. And in the second session, we looked at consciousness and how human consciousness initially gets projected outwards and then into nature, because it's just so overwhelming to recognize that we know that we are, that we know that we are here, that we know that we are being in this moment. And then we project it outwards. And with the incarnation of Jesus, we have this return into the temple of God is within us. There's no temple required, there's no sacrificial system required, there's no religion or ritual required, because the divine is within us. It's the concept of divinity is something that's projected from inside our human conversation with each other and our consciousness outwards. And so today I want to spend just one last general sort of helicopter view, putting some basics in place. So you have gnosis, knowing rather than believing, in session 1. Secondly, we have consciousness and how we can project things outwards and how they return, and how the church makes this massive error. Instead of allowing Jesus to be incarnated and remain in the kingdom of God within us, there's this move to have him ascend back into heaven. And that sets us up for 2,000 years, very necessary years of religion and formation. Today I want to look at one last building block, foundation stone, before we set off with Jesus and look at the radical Christ in terms of the life events, the archetypal life events. And that's really the word I want to look at as archetype. The beginning type, the fundamental type, the essential type. And archetypes are part of our story and our history. They were most carefully defined by Carl Jung, who identified major archetypes. But before that, I want to just, before we get to Jung, I want to just introduce this very important understanding that comes from one of the early church fathers, a guy called Tertullian. His dates, they're pretty rough. We're not particularly sure. He hasn't got a gravestone that we can visit to check. But he's around about 155 to 240 Common Era. So that's the dates, very early, first 2 centuries of the church's history. And he says this, interesting enough, in a debate with the Gnostics, the Docetists. He has this statement where he says what is not assumed is not redeemed. So he's arguing that Jesus had to be fully human to have every single human experience. And that's the key to this Radical Christ series. Jesus had every human experience, because what he did not assume, if Jesus did not become fully human, he could not have redeemed the entire human state and returned it to the divinity that it essentially had in all the religious stories of the various world faiths. Now, ironically, as I said, he was making the statement against the Gnostics, and this is why this whole understanding of Jesus has been so challenging throughout history, because, as I've said in a previous talk, there's not a lot of historical evidence about the Jesus of Nazareth. In fact, there's very little outside of Scripture that refers to Jesus of Nazareth, the historic. So going to try and look for the historical Jesus, as Albert Schweitzer found out and others have found out, is really mission impossible. There's really not a lot you're going to find. It also reminds us the fact that that's almost impossible. Well, it is impossible to do. That literalism is in fact the first blasphemy. Literalism is the first blasphemy. To take any of this literally as so many fundamentalists do, is really the quintessential mistake. You really just trip over the first step out of the as you begin the journey. Do not take any of this literally. Please take it mythically. And when we speak mythically, we're not talking fictitiously. We're talking myths as stories that are essentially true. They might just not have happened in time and in space, but they are absolutely true. So I love the story of the African-American granny who's telling the story of the opening of the Red Sea and the crossing of the Red Sea from Exodus to the grandchildren. She said, "Oh, listen, y'all, your nana's going to tell you a story. I want you to know this is a story about Moses, and the story is absolutely true. It just might not have happened this way." So that's the truth about myths. Myths are absolutely true. They convey deep, profound human meaning, but to go looking for literal references that they actually happened, historically, scientifically, is to miss the whole point. Which introduces me to this whole debate. So you have Tertullian, who is arguing against the Gnostics. The Gnostics had this problem, and we'll touch into it as we go along the course, that Jesus could not have been human because he was so divine, he was so perfect, and for them human nature was sullied and matter was defiled, and so Jesus couldn't possibly have been human because Jesus, the radical Christ, is such a powerful, pure energy. So Tertullian says, no, hold on a minute. What he did not assume, he could not have redeemed. So if he was the Redeemer, if he was the Savior, if he was the one who brings God back into the flesh, he must have taken full incarnation to do that. What he did not assume, he could not have redeemed. So there's this continual tension, and I want us to hold this tension between Jesus, the human, who we can't find in history, and there's this thing about no human can be divine, and then you have the Gnostic saying no divinity can be human, and there's this constant tussle between the literal enfleshed life, the material, and then the psychological, conscious, mystical, spiritual experience. And as we go along, we're going to look at how this pendulum continues to swing. But for this foundational conversation, I want to introduce us to this whole idea of archetypes. Now, archetypes are the essential characters that we find in all mythology. And one of the really helpful contributions of Carl Jung is that he sat down and he made a study of these ancient Gnostic texts. Very few of them were known. They just started appearing with the Nag Hammadi text when they came out in the 1930s, and slowly have been unpacked. Most profoundly by Elaine Pagels in the Gnostic Gospels in the 1980s, and continue to be unpacked. But what Jung discovered as he studied mythology, and of course linking it all the time back to the psychology of consciousness and complexes and human understanding and how our minds function, he constantly comes to these stories, these myths, these absolutely true stories. And he discovers that there are archetypes. Now, there are literally hundreds of archetypes. But Jung identifies 12 essential ones. And I'm going to go through them very quickly with you. And notice how in every story you'll find a combination of some of these archetypes. They are the essential characters that make our stories work, and make our lives work, makes the narrative of our own lives work. And maybe you, as I go through the list, you want to say, I wonder which one of these I am right now in my life. So Jung talks about the innocent, the newborn, the innocent, the one who is naive. There's the orphan, there's the one who doesn't belong, the outsider, the one who's marginalized. There's the hero, the one who goes forth and conquers and liberates. There's the caregiver. There's the nurturer, the mother, the caregiver. There's the explorer, the one who's always pushing the boundaries. And I suppose in this series, that's what I'm being. The strong archetype in the series is to explore. Let's go and have a look. Let's climb over the fences that we've been told never to cross. Let's talk about Gnosticism. Let's talk about heresies. Let's be a little heretical ourselves. The explorer, the rebel. Well, maybe there's a bit of that in this as well. So the rebel archetype, the one who throws away the traces, throws over the traces, breaks the rules. I love that Zen saying that first you learn the rules, then you keep the rules, then you break the rules, and then you become wise. So the rebel archetype, there's the lover, Romeo and Juliet. There's the creator, the story of all the creation myths, the creation stories of how the world came to be. There's the jester, the clown. There's the sage, the wise person, Merlin, the sage who hides away in shadow madness, but when he appears, he speaks such wisdom, people can't believe he brings his truth. There's the magician, also Merlin. He's the one who creates the great mysteries and understands them. And then there's the ruler, the king. So these are the 12, the innocent, the orphan, the hero, the caregiver, the explorer, the rebel, the lover, the creator, the sage, the jester, the magician, the ruler. These are all archetypes. These are all essential characters in our stories. And at various times in our life, part of our journey helps us to discover how these archetypes grab hold of us, and we find ourselves almost like an asteroid traveling past, gets into the grip of a planet and then orbits that planet, and in fact might even crash into the planet. We can often find ourselves in the grip of an archetype. And if I could get personal just for a little minute, there was a time when I was going into the ministry. For the second time, I had gone in as a young man, studied theology, dropped out after my first year, and then 5 or 6 years later came back in. And in that second journey, I became completely in the grip of the archetype of the priest, of the magician, the sage, that kind of archetype, if we go back to the list of 12. And it was at the time that there was a series on television called The Thornbirds. I think it was Colleen McCulloch's novel about the Thornbirds, and Richard Chamberlain played the role of Father de Bricassor. I tell you, I was completely enraptured by this archetype. It became my whole persona, so much so that about 3 years into this journey into the ministry, I was already back in the ministry, I undertook a Rorschach ink blot test. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's a psychological test where you are shown ink blots, literally ink that's been put on paper and blotted, and there's a series of these pictures, and you are asked simply to say what you see in the picture, and what you say helps the therapist to understand what you're seeing. And the person who was doing the Rorschach test on me showed me these pictures. Now, people see all sorts of things because they're completely abstract ink blots. So people can see sexual images often, they can see, who knows, all sorts of fantasies, but your unconscious is revealed. Well, here's the thing about being in the grip of the archetype of this magician, sage, priest. In every one of the ink blots I was shown, I saw either a church or a cathedral or some religious image. I was in the grip of an archetype. And so very often we will find ourselves in the grip of those archetypes as a lover or as a caregiver, and we obsess just around that particular role. And that's why in things like narrative therapy, it's very useful, and I do this often in my therapy. I will ask the person to identify who they are in the story of their life. Because very often people who come into counseling with me will arrive and they will tell their story as the victim. And that's obviously why they've come for help. They are the victim of circumstances, the victim of their life. And slowly as we talk and they tell their story, I, as the listener, recognize that this is not a victim story. This is a heroic story, because, most people are incredibly heroic. to simply get up every morning and feed your children and carry on with life is incredibly heroic. And so narrative therapy is simply helping people go from seeing themselves in the grip of the victim archetype to maybe moving towards the heroic archetype. Now, all of this is simply as background. So archetypes are primal, ancient roles that have always been played in human culture. We've always had the innocents, the orphans, the hero, the caregiver, explorer, rebel, lover, creator, jester, sage, magician, ruler, and many, many others. Carolyn Myss, MYSS, Carolyn Myss has got a whole book about archetypes, and I think she's got about 80 of them that she's unpacked. And then she still leaves blank pages for you to create your own. So as many characters as you can create in a story, that's as many archetypes as you can get. The point about archetypes is that they are these ancient roles. And the reason I want to put the archetypal energy into this foundation of these first three steps, that part of the knowing and not believing the dogma of Jesus, but getting to know the inner Christ, the radical Christ, the Christ at the root of our consciousness and our being, the Christ that was projected outwards and is now incarnated back into us. The reason I'm talking about archetypes is that in the life of Jesus, going back to Tertullian's statement, what is not assumed is not redeemed. I want to suggest that we look at the life of Jesus as an archetypal human story, that every role that Jesus plays in that whole narrative that we have of his life in the Gospels, both Gnostic and canonical Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the apocryphal Gospels, in all of the manifestations of Jesus, in the telling of the story of the radical Christ, we have a universal human story. Just as the Buddhists have a universal human story from the East, and in the Hindu pantheon of thousands of gods with Shiva and Vishnu and Ganesha and Lakshmi and Hanuman, also archetypal characteristics. The reason I'm coming back to the radical Christ, and as I said before, people are saying, Peter, why are you even bothering? I mean, Christianity, official Christianity is in so much trouble. I'm coming back to the radical Christ because I believe as Westerners, in our art and in our culture and in our awareness, Jesus is so in our DNA that it's better to start here. I'm not saying we can't look at the life of the Buddha and that we can't look at the life of Eastern experiences and the Tao of China and the life of Muhammad in Islam. In all of these other religions, we can connect with them. But as Westerners, I think Jesus, the radical Christ, is psychologically very accessible because of these archetypal connections. And that's why I'm unpacking this particular story in a way that I hope will help to integrate your life and mine in a more meaningful way as we come to recognize that in Jesus we have a map, an archetypal map for every one of our lives, because what he assumed, he redeemed, and he did it all. So Jesus, I believe, is the quintessential complete human life. I believe, and I'm going to be quite controversial at times to say that Jesus had every single human experience that is possible. And that's what the radical Christ is going to unpack as we try to make sense of our lives in this crazy time. Here we are in the 21st century. CE. Here we are in a world that seems to have gone insane. We have people talking about things like zombie apocalypses. We watch people dumbing down everything. We watch people gazing at televisions and being fed with data and information that they haven't got the capacity to process a 1 percentile of. People have lost meaning. They have fallen into consumerism. They have fallen into just spending money, trying to find meaning, and creating debt loads that are unsustainable in the midst of all this chaos. And let's be honest, it is chaotic, in addition to the coronavirus, which is rampant as I speak. In the midst of what seems to be chaos, I want to suggest that there is meaning to be found if we can reincarnate the reality of God consciousness through Jesus by looking at his life as an archetypal map. Jesus in all the different aspects of the life that is told about this mythical person. This absolutely true, albeit not historically accurate or scientifically accurate person, but this absolutely true incarnation of divinity. The exploration is so that we, through the archetypes, can begin to understand that in the life of Jesus, if the more we dig into it, the more we find maps of meaning. To quote Jordan Peterson's first book, Maps of Meaning is what he called it, which is really a great exploration of psychology and meaning. It's a serious workout. And I'm not always a fan of Jordan Peterson, but he makes some very profound points. But Jesus, I want to suggest, is the ultimate map of meaning. Jesus is the map of my life. When I go to look at the life of Jesus, I find connections to my own life, and he helps my life make sense today. And that is, for me, quite radical. We need a guide. We need to know that somebody has gone down this path before us and has found a way. And I believe that Jesus is that way. So people will say to me, do you believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, the life? And I say, you know what? You're coming at me with dogma and you're saying, do I believe? I'll tell you what I do know. I'm not going to answer that question because that's just arrogant and you're going to box me based on my answer. I'm going to answer it this way. That having looked at Jesus archetypally as a map, I want to say that Jesus is my way, my truth, my life. And I don't believe that. I know it. So I look forward to continuing the journey with you. And thanks you once again for your attention. And thank you very much for your attention.